Wales, and welcome everyone to our lecture this morning. If you haven't bought any raffle tickets, you may want to do that very quickly now, or wait until just before we draw the raffles. Just one announcement before we begin our lecture. Our friends at the Beyond the Butterfield, which is held at the Dakota Track Memorial Walkway, they also run a series of lectures, and their next one is on next Saturday on the 11th, and Dr. Peter Williams will be speaking on the topic of what did Japanese veterans think about World War II, and that's based on his book. So if you're interested, that's being held at the Dakota Track Memorial Walkway. So this morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Lieutenant Colonel retired David Deasy, OAM, who served in the Australian Army Reserves for 33 years before retiring. He's the co-author of the History of the University of New South Wales Regiment. David also is a retired teacher, having taught English and history at various schools for over 37 years. In 2019, David was awarded the Medal of Honour of Australia for service to community history, particularly in connection with his work as chair of the National War Memorial Association New South Wales Committee. And this morning, David will speak to us on a topic of the railway companies that served during World War I. Can we put our hands together and welcome David?
Thanks, Rob. Look, it's great to be back. I think this is the fourth time that I've spoken to the Society over the years, and we're going to have a look at a fairly rare set of individuals, and that is the Australian railway companies of World War I. Now, if you go and try and do some research on this, you'll get some quite weird and wonderful views about what this was all about. Starting with the person who said to me, I don't know why they even allowed them to join the railways. They should have put them in the infantry. To which I responded at the time with my version of the old aphorism: amateurs talk about tactics and weapon systems, professionals talk logistics and sensors. Okay, what's this all about? Hopefully we can unpack some of this. There's a lot to do and a short time to do it in, and we're going to move on as quickly as we can. Right?
I'm glad it's not just me who does that.
It's there, I know. Technology is great.
Why not?
Thank you. Australia's contribution overall. Let's start with where we started the war. On the 4th of August 1914, the Australian government immediately offered to send a volunteer force, 20,000 men, made up of an infantry division and a mounted brigade. Now, there's a lot in that, because some of the provisos which are relevant to this discussion are that Australians were to remain Australians. There had been a lot of discussion in the 10 years, 14 years or so since the Boer War, about whether Australia would simply send bulk lots of people to join British units. But Australia had made a clear decision: we will send an Australian force to be commanded by Australians where possible, and where commanded by non-Australians, the commanders would be honorary Australians and have direct access to Melbourne, which is where Army headquarters was, where the capital of Australia was at that time. Okay, now I might add, because a lot of people can't understand this, the British officers commanding Australians are often more rigorous users of that provision than Australians themselves. And a number of British officers did their careers no great good in the British Army by simply telling their British superiors they weren't going to do what they were told because they were Australians. That's why you can find personnel files on people like Birdwood in the National Archives. Okay, so as an old schoolie, always like to find out what the class might actually know. Right? And there are 3 photos on the screen, and I'll give you a helping hand here. On the left of the screen we have William Birdwood, in the centre James Whiteside Mackay, and on the right, for those who can't recognise him, John Monash. Who can tell me who was the AIF commander in 1918? Anyone want to give me a name? Yes?
Monash.
Anyone else? Birdwood. Yeah. The AIF commander in 1918 is William Birdwood, not Monash. Monash commands the Australian Corps. I say that this is important because what we're talking about today are AIF soldiers who are not part of the Australian Corps. They are part of the AIF under direct command of Birdwood. Okay? So let's have a look at what the AIF looked like. AIF headquarters, Commander General Sir William Birdwood. Note that even as a Corps commander, he was a 4-star general commanding a Corps. Very interesting for those people today who want to argue that if you're doing a job, you have to actually have the rank. And surely he would have been an army commander. It was later in the war, but not then. The second in command and officer commanding in the Middle East is Lieutenant General Sir Harry Chevelle. And then we go down to headquarters Australian Corps, John Monash. AIF Depots UK, Major General Sir James Mackay. And the unattached troops, i.e. our railway people, that's where they fit, is the Deputy Adjutant General of the headquarters AIF, Tommy Dodds. And there's Tommy on the right of the screen. Billy Hughes tried to sack him in 1918 because he came and gave Dodds a direct order about the AIF. And Dodds said, "You cannot talk to me, you have to talk to the boss." And he said, "I'm telling you, I'm the Prime Minister, I command the Australians." And Dodds told him to shuffle off the buffalo or sit on the rough end of the pineapple. And in true Australian vernacular. And Hughes tried to have him sacked, and Birdwood told Hughes to go jump. Okay, so let's have a look now about how we're going to supply the troops in the field. How did they think they were supplying the troops in 1914? And it was quite simple. From the ports of France, broad gauge rail to the railhead. Let's explain that just for a moment. We're talking broad gauge rail, in fact, is standard gauge rail. We call them broad gauge because the French have a metre gauge system. And so to avoid any confusion, the companies operating on the main lines were called broad gauge railway companies. From there, you had motor transport. I mean, the Germans didn't even have this in part in World War II. The British were proposing to use trucks from the railhead to the corps or divisional dumps, and then horse transport from the divisional dump down to the unit level. That was the plan. So there we are. And they had trucks like that. Each one carries probably a ton, 2 tons of stores. I say that because it's important when we look at what light railway will mean. And of course you have your earliest personnel carriers, London buses. I might add, Monash used that to bring up some of his divisions in 1918. Okay, so this is the French view of what was going to happen. And the British went along with it. It was going to be a very short war. Over by Christmas is the generic term. I don't think the General Staff actually thought it was over by Christmas, but certainly it wouldn't last longer than 12 months. There'd be very few British divisions involved, particularly in the early phases, maybe 12. Remember the earliest British force there was only 4 infantry divisions, supported by a cavalry division. Okay, From the French point of view, we don't want the Brits mucking around with our railways. We have a different philosophy, and besides, they speak English. We were on the railways, and the Brits say the Brits, okay, short walk, we don't need to worry about it. Let's talk about different philosophies just for a moment. Again, logisticians will understand the implications of this. The French believed in running light trains or medium level trains and a number of them. So if you had a heavy train, you broke it into, put two engines on. Sorry, I rephrase that. That was the British approach, and you ran at an average speed of 20-25 kilometres an hour. The French view was you put as many carriages on as possible, and you ran it at 8 to 10 kilometres an hour. Now, you can't have the two philosophies operating on the same set of tracks. Right, so what went wrong? What could go wrong? Well, there are more British divisions on the Somme in 1916 than ever envisaged in the whole army. There are more divisions in Rawlinson's 4th Army that the Australians joined in 1916 than had ever been thought of. It's going to be a long war. Artillery is using up transportation in exponential increase. Just to give you some idea of that, in 1918, the American 2nd Corps, operating as part of the British 4th Army, and 2 divisions, only one actually in contact, fired 380,000 shells in one night before the start of its offensive. All those shells have to come up from the coast. They have to get there somehow. French railways do not cope. They cannot cope. And to make matters worse, the French are conscripting railway workers into the infantry. So there are less and less people to do the repairs, less and less people to run the trains. And so the French put their hands up and say, can you help? There are acute fuel shortages in Britain. You won't find this in most of the books. During the Somme battle, the British Army is using an average of 12,000 gallons of petrol per day. Doesn't sound much today. Wouldn't go very far in New South Wales today, but you can see this is in fact a problem. And Lloyd George writes to Haig and says, listen, if you can't cut your petrol down, I'm going to have to stop the buses in London and in Manchester and Liverpool. In other words, the working class needs these buses to get to work in ammunition factories to make stuff for you. We have to do something. All right, so that's the two-pronged problem. And the Western Front conditions are not helpful. I think everyone has a vision of the Western Front in their mind, but transport starts to bog down. And trucks are in fact not as efficient as you would think, because they have to drive from their depots to the loading point, load up, drive all the way to their tasking area, drop it off, drive all the way back to their depot. They're going out of their way. So, this is the British response. You appoint a transport supremo, and you have centralised command and control, and you move as much as you can onto railways, because it's really the only all-weather system which will cope. And so the system becomes broad gauge to the railhead, War Department light railway, and this is the key change. This is the extraordinary thing which actually happens. Everyone can understand broad gauge railway, standard gauge railway, but the light railway is the key thing. And then from the War Department light railway, you transfer to the trench railway or tramway, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So enter without control. Not Sir Topham Hatt, but Sir Eric Geddes. This gentleman was an executive of the Northwestern Railway Company in the UK. And he was appointed direct from his civilian office to be a Major General reporting directly to Haig, which upset a number of senior staff officers. because even the Quartermaster General had no say on what was happening on transport. It was all controlled by this man. Big staff, well, perhaps not a big staff, but the rest of it, but big job of his staff was to make sure he wore his uniform correctly. Incidentally, just to, as a bit of an aside, once he had sorted out the ammunition problem in the UK, remember the shell shortages and fuses didn't go off, this guy sorted it out, only to find that it now was building up on the docks in France and wasn't being brought forward. So he's now got hold of the transport, and that's all transport, by the way, water transport, meter gauge, and establishing this light rail system, and establishing it as a system. Once he gets that sorted out, they say, well, you better come and sort the Navy out. We've got problems in the Navy. So they transfer him from being a Major General in the Army to being a Vice Admiral in the Navy in charge of the naval supports. I offer this because there are people in Australia today who will look at you point blank and say, you can't do that. And I'm saying to you, history shows that you can. And it's happened in Australia, not just in the UK. If anyone wants to query that, just have a look at Admiral Mike Hudson, who was Chief of the Navy about 1990, as a 4-star Admiral. All right, so we have total control, which means nobody plays to the trains except these guys. You'll see in a moment, they have representatives at each Army headquarters, but they're representatives. The Army commander can ask for assistance. He can't direct what's going to happen on the trains. Right, so it's fed in at the top level and it's produced at the bottom level. And no one, especially unit quartermasters, are going to fiddle with the trains. These are his two successors. Major General Philip Nash, who's like Geddes, has to be shown how to wear his uniform because he's a railway executive too, and then Major General Sidney Cruikshank, who is an engineer officer. And it's Cruikshank who actually loses control, or a lot of the control of the railways, not because he's incompetent, but because the politics eventually builds up. And that's important again for our story. So, Australia gets involved. We need railway men. Haig is told to sort it out as best he can with Geddes' assistance, and they start to create a railway organisation, the like of which has never been seen before. It's like starting from scratch to create the national railway system of Australia. Right? It spreads over an area of about half of New South Wales, but with all the railways that you can think of in Australia. Australia has asked, would you contribute? And there were serious problems. One, Australia is in the middle of a conscription debate. And the government was saying, unless we introduce conscription, we can't keep the force that we have up to strength. And to demonstrate the point, they actually disbanded the building 6th Division, and they wanted to disband Monash's 3rd Division. Right? So, and maybe Aldo should take some notice of this, it would seem fairly strange if you then said, let's raise some more units in Australia. So that's the first problem. It's not part of our original offer to Britain, and primarily, these people are going to fall into the forbidden zone. They are not going to be in Australian units, they're going to be in Royal Engineer units, controlled by Britain, not under Australian command. So, Australia is not terribly thrilled. So, what we start with is that Byrd was authorised to form a railway unit from his own resources, if practicable. And what is formed is the first ANZAC Railway Corps. Is formed, it's a light railway. I'm back at it. Australia accepts the urgency of the quest, and its recruiting is undertaken to raise 5 sections company from a pool of people who otherwise would not enlist. That is, you go direct to the railway yards and you ask for railway workers to join. You say to them, you don't have to be the same physical fitness as people joining for general duties. you lift the age to 55. In fact, we know that was interpreted very loosely. There were guys on the Western Front who were in their 60s. The attempt to keep them in-house fails. The 5 RE companies are formed, plus the ANZAC depot company. ANZAC Railways is broken up to form the 6th company. People talk about it becoming the 6th company. It doesn't. It's broken up, and we'll see why in a moment. Okay, so the key development in all this is the War Department Light Railways. Nice pictures of trains. So, and these are some of the conditions on the Western Front. You can see why railways would be useful here. Bruce Bansfair actually suggested that tubes might be an interesting development. He also suggested this. Here's an example of what the infantry had to put up with. Having a railway to carry all that stuff would be useful. Okay, so we'll have a look first at First ANZAC Light Railways, which is a standout. It's got nothing really to do, well, it does, but it's formed on the Western Front. It's a bird with white special. And here's the boss, one Albert Futrell. Albert Futrell was a Queensland Railway engineer, civil engineer, and he would go on to become the chief civil engineer of New South Wales Railways. His prime thing would be building the new railway bridge over the Hawkesbury River. So when you travel to Gosford next time, you travel over the bridge, that's a Futrell special. He was then commanding the 4th Pioneer Battalion, and so we get one ANZAC Railways, and people will tell you that's the first railway company. It is, but the number does not relate to the unit name. The number says this is the ANZAC Light Railway Group attached to the 1st ANZAC Corps. It's not a unit number as such. And it's also a unit which is strictly forbidden. Now it's controlled directly by ANZAC headquarters. It's a unit-sized force. He's a lieutenant colonel. He's got 2 companies of pioneers attached to his battalion, and he's got the railways. So that's exactly what Geddes and exactly what the Brits don't want. Okay. So we've got this, and they start out essentially with what's called the Deckerville system. You see there, they're Meccano sets. We'll look at that in a minute. And everyone thinks like railways, and I've even seen it on Wikipedia, they talk about them as trench railways. And really that's a term which is meaningless if you want to talk about light railways and what's happening in the trenches, and these Meccano set type things. Let's have a look at how the light railway organisation worked very quickly. You'll see that there is an assistant director, very lean organisation, an assistant director light railways, sitting at what you might call the operational level, mechanical department operating forward areas, etc. And they're usually a lieutenant colonel or major. And if they have a staff, they have a couple of captains. And each army gets a representative, a assistant director like railway at army headquarters with their particular staff. And as I said, they're not co-located with the army headquarters. The lieutenant colonel is a staff officer from railways who is the advisor, not the staff officer of the army commander. Have a quick look at this network system here, and you can see that this is a distribution area. The light railway stuff is this stuff here. Sorry, this brown stuff going forward. Heavy rail coming in alongside it to offload. And this is just the light railway network behind the Second Army around Emperor. You can just see how complicated it is. And different groups have different names. I'll just point out to you if I can see it. Yeah, up here we have ANZAC. A bit further up here we have Sturdy. And the Sturdy is later Chief of the General Staff of Australia and Commander of the 1st Australian Army. You just see how complicated it's all become and all-encompassing. So we have a look at the early things on tramways, and we need to look at what tramway is versus what a light railway is. I was having a discussion with people about whether or not our light railways today were trams or railways. Now, it's an interesting philosophical discussion. What's in the name? But tramways and trench railways are quite different to the light railways, even though they're using the same trackage and maybe even interconnected. And the earliest thing was started by the Canadians, and someone at Crewe thought up the idea of putting a T-model Ford on rails, and this is often called a Crewe tractor. They're, even the light railways use them for inspection vehicles, but the Canadians used them early on, and there are, at the end of 1916, there are all these little systems, like the ANZAC system, the Canadian system, and they got organised. So eventually you had probably 20 or 30 light railway companies, plus a lot of heavy railway companies. The Canadians raised something like 13 railway construction battalions, noting of course that they kept them under their command. They weren't part of the Canadian Corps, but they were part of the Canadian force.
David, just quickly, what are the steering wheels for?
I'm holding on to, I think.
They're driven by officers.
Yes.
That explains it.
Driven by officers. Don't ask me why the steering wheel was kept, because you certainly couldn't steer with it. I think it just gave the people behind the wheel some confidence that they were in control of the operation. There was a great deal of problems because quite often the trench railways were connected to the light railways. And there's one memorable passage where there is a very terse communication from the Assistant Director of Light Railways Army to the 3rd Australian Division, that's Monash, saying there are, and basically went through the sins that had been committed. Like people were using light railway trackage to actually bring tramway equipment onto it. And he said clowns were actually dragging wagons with mules through switches, as the points, without bothering to change them, and that buggered the entire system up very nicely. Some genius had taken a number of 9-ton wagons like this onto the tramway where they had been shelled by the Germans and destroyed. Would you kindly cease this immediately? So quite often tramways had to be broken. But there were instances where, it's a moot point about who owns what, but the light railways were concerned because the difference between a tramway and a railway is a railway runs like a railway. That might sound odd if you don't know anything about railways, but we'll have a look later on. The earliest stuff was this Decaville stuff, what they call the Meccano set. These are rated at about 9 pounds per yard track. Right, that's the weight of a single piece of metal, 1 yard long. And you can see you can pick it up, you can lay it anywhere, great. But it's absolutely of no use if you want to cart heavy loads regularly over it at some sort of speed. So the myth is that all the light railways are like this. In fact, if you read Futrell, he says that the minimum for light railway should be 30 pounds per yard. And if you lay 30 pounds per yard, you don't have Meccano sets, you have full 6x4 sleepers and things like that. So we have what constitutes a railway. Here's your signal box. The signalman being protected somewhat in case of the Germans shell it or bomb it. And I'm not going to go through what all these are, but you can see these are train control boards. which a normal railwayman was perfectly well understood in those days. Okay, so we construct eventually 3 light rail companies, and you'll see that they're numbered as British companies. Number 15, ANZAC Light Railway, number 16, number 17. The 17th is the old first ANZAC company, which has been not just rebadged. First ANZAC is disbanded, and that's what the documents say. Those railway people are then granted into the new number 17 Light Railway Operating Company. So 17 has no connection history-wise to the previous operators, because they're now in the British system. Bird would hang on to his railwaymen right to the last possible minute, but he was virtually ordered to give them up. Let's have a quick look at the motive power of this. Now these light ones, 20 horsepower simplex, could get down onto these light tracks. They weigh about 2 tonnes, and but they can still pull some quite heavy loads. Then you had this baby here, which came in 3 versions: the open one, the protected one, which is at the top right, and the armoured one, which is on the left. And you can see why they needed that. Hang on, back a minute. No, the next one we've got petrol electric. This was really a standard commercial one, but some genius thought that they might actually put it was capable of operating electrically off a catenary. It took apparently some people in the UK some time to work out that you couldn't actually run catenary across the battlefield. That's the electric wires. I might add, while they're most powerful of that particular group, they're also a bit unstable. They had a bad habit of coming off light lines. And the first steamers we've got there are light ones produced by Hudswell Clark, like the Hudson, very similar, but there are problems with these. The chief problem is their range. They're not designed, they were designed basically for dockyards and for small industrial plants. They're not designed for long running. They don't carry enough water. And they actually were experimenting with how they could put basically a water tank on the back of them to keep them going further, but decided that they would go for a much bigger version. This is the Hunslet, UK, and then from America, Ball locomotives were produced, so much bigger water tanks. And finally, the Alco, which the Australians all often call the Cook locomotive because it was produced in the Cook locomotive plant, which was part of the Alco organisation. Australians liked this one. It was the biggest one, 7.5 tonnes. But they liked it because you had a trailing set of wheels. So if you're running tender first, as we call it, it meant it was a much more stable on light lines. That would actually keep the engine a lot stable. And as always, water is actually more important than coal in locomotives, steam locomotives. And they had different ways of doing it, and the engines were able to actually suck water, had pumps that could suck water themselves. Let's have a look at trackage. I said before, heavy trackage needed, and heavy sleepers and so on. You can see there, you're not talking about Meccano asset there, you're talking 30-40 pounds per yard, heavy sleepers, and it's designed to bring ammunition right up to the gun position. And you have a look, I just have a quick look at some of the terrain that these are tracking over. And this one I've just shown, just to show you, on the right you've got your standard gauge lines, and on the left the light railway running parallel so that they can offload between the two systems. And here we've got what's called a gauntlet track, where the light rail actually runs in tandem with the broad gauge. There are advantages and disadvantages of that system. And for our armoured people there's a photo of a tank in somewhat dissolute condition. But you can see the problems that they had, engineering, and so you had Canadian battalions constantly on repair, but the light railway people often had to do it themselves. So occupational hazards, you can see there on the left, the line has suddenly been interrupted, and that's not going to be a 5-minute job to repair that. On the right, you can see shrapnel damage to one of the petrol motors, and you wouldn't want to be a driver in there with shrapnel coming through. As I said, the Kerr type of locomotive had a bad habit of coming off on curves because it was top heavy on light lines. And like anything else, light lines tend to split and engines come off. So the railway had a full coterie of cranes and breakdown vehicles to recover vehicles if necessary. You might have noticed on the slide for the flyer for this, the pioneers are actually putting a railway engine back on the track manually. Again, this is obviously where trucks are meeting the railhead and someone's on the area. A constant problem. So they have a quick look at our workshop area, and you can see this is starting to look like a railway that we would understand. This is not a trench railway, this is the light railway. And everything they needed could be mobile. Their workshops were actually on carriages. And you simply just let down the side of the carriage and you're ready to go. I might just add there, you can see that they could have various sections where they could offload the trains. If they had enough time, Germans advanced, you could get engines away. It wasn't always possible. During the German advance of 1918, a standard broad gauge operator from Australia was told to take some Canadian engineers out to carry out some demolitions. And when he got there, guess who was confronting him with rifles? Germans. Oops, someone in intelligence had messed that one up. And the engines at the bottom had to be left behind and were sabotaged so the Germans couldn't use them. But you could provide a fast executive passenger service. On the front we have His Majesty the King talking with the Commander of the First Army, Henry Horn. Someone we don't normally hear about. Just quietly gone on with his job. This is probably running on tramway trackage, but you can see that the equipment is very light, 20 horsepower and 2 carriages, not very heavy. The 4th Pioneer, this is passenger service for the lower classes, 4th Pioneer Battalion on the move, loaded on trucks. And you could carry heavy freight. You could get, here you've got a 6-inch howitzer being loaded onto a light rail wagon. So heavy freight. And here we've got some 60-pounders loaded on light rail wagons. By the way, before anyone asks, you can't load tanks onto a light railway. Far too big. And here, again, I'm just demonstrating the railway. This is the sort of thing which Assistant Director of Light Railways used to take their volume over, because the railways actually produced drained embankments. People used to use it for dragging for their own purposes. This is the sort of thing which would make the ADLR cry. Someone's dragging heavy howitzer up an embankment. Not recommended at all. Okay, so let's have a quick look now at the broad gauge operating companies. There are 3 of those. 35th broad gauge operating company, which eventually becomes the 4th, 59th and 60th. Now you'll notice in all this that none of these numbers are sequential necessarily. So you've got 39, 59, 60. They're not designed to say this is a block of numbers for Australia. If anything, they're designed to say your Royal Engineers, you just happen to be manning them from Australia, but here's your number so that you don't think you're something like part of a national organisation. And you have, like everything else, when like you first start, you grab every piece of equipment they can lay their hands on. But eventually they standardise, just as in light rail. This is the British version of the standard locomotive, which is we call it 280, from Great Central Railway originally. A number of them ended up in the Hunter Valley coalfields after the war. And it's this type of loco that pulled the train to the surrender or to their armistice at Compington Forest. This is a Baldwin version, which the Australians preferred because it was the heaviest and the most powerful. And the Australians always managed to seem to get the equipment they wanted. Partly because I think British railwaymen and others gravitated to what they knew, and partly because the Australians were good at nicking things or acquiring things that and while someone else was making up their mind, they knew exactly what they wanted. Now, there is a whole range of motive power. I can't show you everything today. Some of it is extraordinary, some of it is quite antique. We've got on the right-hand side, we've got a Belgian locomotive of extraordinary antiquity. On the left is a Canadian locomotive of an old Wild West style. And the problem being, of course, you need quantity and you need standardisation. So there are something like 500 plus British standard locomotives produced, and much the same for the Baldwins. But there are all sorts of collections. ROD stands for Railway Operating Division. It's the name of the railway section of the transportation group. And Geddes is, if you like, the divisional commander. That's why there's a Major General there. So he actually commands the Railway Operating Division. We've got an American import on the left, London to Brighton Railway on the right. I think Northwestern Railway left, and then something didn't work. This is the bottom right was imported from Alco as a shunter. It was regarded as useless by the Australians and discarded. So not everything works, but you try everything when you've got nothing. And there are, of course, accidents when you get to broad gauge lines as well. And for Paul, this is where you can only broad gauge. Now, if you want to bring tanks to the front, you can bring them up on broad gauge railway and they can drive on their tracks. They're your two options. So when you look at some of non-Ash's assaults and you say, why didn't he have tanks? He always had tanks. The answer is, one, they broke them down and hadn't been repaired. Two, they couldn't get them close enough to drive on their tracks. So that's like, if you're going to wait for the tanks, you have to wait a while till they get the railways repaired and get them further forward. But they could carry them on the broad gauge, and they could carry them straight from the factories in England on these wagons and bring them across the channel, put them on trains there without debussing the tanks. Now, I want to talk about some of these people. I'll show you Arthur Blackburn. So I said there were 60-year-olds on the someone once asked me, why, as I said before, why would they be allowed to do that? Well, this is Arthur Blackburn. He served, the medal you see him wearing is Boer War, Tasmanian, served in the Tasmanian Mounted Infantry in Boer War, was nominated for officer training in 1915, and between the nomination and turning up, he fell under a train and had his leg cut off in a shunting accident. So he decided when they called for railway volunteers at the end of 1916 that he would volunteer. And he almost got to the selection process because basically he chatted non-stop to the doctor, and when he was asked to show his legs, he showed the same one both times. He was almost through. Except unfortunately there was another doctor watching from the side who said, hang on a minute, I couldn't see that left leg, show me that. And they said, oh no, it can't be. And he said, well, I drive a train every day, surely I can drive a train on the Western Front. And they said, you know, he's right, okay, let him go. So he ended up being the company sergeant major of one of the companies, which meant of course he could adjust his own work schedule to fit his disability. And he went through the whole of the Western Front with one leg. But I think you can see that he's probably not suitable for infantry. That's right. Can he do the job? And that was the way people were select. Can this person do the job we want? And some people were found out, not by anything that they'd done, but the winter of 1917-18 was one of the worst winters in 60 or 70 years. And many of the older guys suffered greatly because the temperature never got above about -5 degrees. And a number had to be sent home for that reason. Much to their disgust, but but that was the risk everyone took in taking the older generation onto the Western Front. There were young guys too, but I just point out that the average age of the 5 companies which were not recruited on the Western Front was significantly higher than the average age of the average AIF unit. Just to show you, I showed you the lines for one of the army's light rail system. The Australians were based around here. It's one of their main operating depots. But where did they go? Well, they travelled the whole system. Anywhere the British rail went, the Australian railway companies operated. One of them did operate briefly on a metre gauge system, but we don't know much about that. Right, so let's have a look at what happens in 1918. Obviously, Birdwood and White are less than happy with what's occurred. These are now exactly what Australia did not want. Australians operating under direct British command and not being part of the AIF. Notionally, individuals are, but as units they're not. So their reporting chain will go up through the ADLR Army, through to British Army headquarters. Then if there's a local issue, they'll come across to ANZAC depots in England. And then finally it might get back to RAF headquarters in France. It's not a good look, and it's not what the Australians wanted. That's a good question. They agreed to it because of the sense of operational emergency. You want your people fed and resourced, you do it our way. And think about it, you can see the reasons for that. And given that Britain was the actual transportation system to get something under control was highly centralised. And so we're not having national commands. So, in early 1918, a number of people said to British Army headquarters, look, this was fine when we were on the Somme, but now we're talking about a war of movement. We're not going to be able to keep the light railways moving forward, and we really need a more flexible control system. Transportation needs to come under command of the Quartermaster General of the force, that is the Chief Logistics Officer, not be a direct reporting unit to Hague. And remember, Hague's headquarters was undergoing a huge transformation at that time, brought about by political pressure after the failures of Passchendaele, and people were being thrown out, new people were being brought in. And so London accepted that's the way it had to be, and that's what happened. And this is where Birdwood and White pounced. Seeing what happened, they said, look, this is a convoluted system. Our people are being disadvantaged in promotions and allowances and things like that because we can't understand what's going on. So they let the Australians take back control of the railway companies. Look and see what happens. We're going to appoint an Australian railway headquarters. It'll be purely administrative. Ho, ho, ho. So the purely administrative officer you appoint is Lieutenant Colonel S.H. Hancock's DSO, 3 times mentioned in dispatches. You appoint a very senior engineer officer as an administrator, right? Come on, guys, that's not going. That is a deliberate con by Australian headquarters. This guy had been a major, and I suspect had been second in command of first ANZAC Light Railways. He would go on to run Hobart Transport after the war. You're talking about a technical specialist that you're not going to give up simply to push a bit of paper around. He's not just an administrator, but he's a very, very good officer. And he takes command of the 6 Australian companies. It's not just administration. You find him regularly arguing with assistant directors of light railways about technical issues, about where railway engines will be repaired. He doesn't interfere with the operations, right? He's a good operator in that sense. But he reports directly to the Deputy Adjutant General Colonel Thomas Dodds, whose photo we saw. We rename all the Australian companies. This is S.H. Hancock, and that's, again, he's a militia officer pre-war. Everything about him screams, this is the best railway officer we have available, and we're putting him in charge of railways. Does that sound like an administration decision? No. And he's not about pushing paper around. And so here's our organisation in 1918. They are renumbered as Australian Railway Companies, brackets AIF, right? Number 1 to number 6 operating companies. All right. Just looking at a few of the personnel, and we've got Corporal Kelso here, who did us a great deal of photos. All the photos you saw earlier, he took, and are now in the War Memorial. So let me sort of finish by looking at the strange case of these engines. Some of you will know them as the T-class, which is what they were when they came to service, or 50-class locomotives. The last 50-class locomotive joined the New South Wales fleet in 1912. So how do we end up manufacturing 10 more during the war? Because New South Wales engines were already 2 generations further on at that time. The answer is quite simple. During the war, in 1915, before anyone's talking about Australian railways, we have this sort of thing. Now this is actually a sapper from the railways. You can see he's suffered some horrific injuries. But from Gallipoli onwards, we're starting to get these people coming back to Australia. They're being processed in Melbourne, and then they're being dumped on normal trains and sent home to Adelaide, to Sydney, to Brisbane. And there are 2 reactions in the press. Number 1 is, how dare you do this? My children were horrified when they saw this person with no legs on the train. No, shocked. No, I shouldn't be confronted with this. I paid my fare. I shouldn't have to look at someone who's disabled. There was a Norfolk Island soldier, Fletcher Clintle, who was shot through the left eye, came out through the back of his skull. You can imagine he wanted to go back to the war. The government said they weren't allowing anyone of that sort of disfigurement that would send a bad message to people. But this is the sort of reaction we get. The other reaction is, listen, I travelled from Albury on the overnight express, and there's a poor guy there in a wheelchair, and we couldn't fit him into a proper seat. Now something needs to be done about looking after these people. So you've got these two competing things. And so what they did is they developed ambulance trains in Victoria, in Queensland, and in New South Wales. Here's a New South Wales ambulance train at Campsie in about 1917, pulled by the 13 carriages, if you want to count them, and it's pulled by a standard passenger engine. But the New South Wales chief mechanical engineer decided that he wanted dedicated motive power on his ambulance trains. And New South Wales industry was at full capacity. So thinks we'll go back to North British, who built a number of our 50 class, and we'll order 10, ship them out here. They're for military purposes. Great. Problem was, by the time they got built, Britain needed railway engines in France and fast. And so the entire New South Wales section was seized and sent to France. Now, 5 of those had not been built to specifications. Some of you railway people understand this, but where you're using copper in the firebox, they were using steel because the copper was in short supply in Britain. End of the war comes, and so Britain then offers those 10 engines back to New South Wales at 1/3 increase over the initial contract price when they've been flogged to death on the French railways. And believe it or not, New South Wales wasn't stupid, and they said, thank you, no thank you. Besides which, we've got more engines that we need coming offline, so the need for these is gone. And so they trotted about in Belgium until about, I think the last disappeared about 1940-41, and the Germans cut them up for scrap and carted them off to Germany. But it's an interesting little sidelight of what actually happens in warfare. There are some survivors in Australia. There are 3 of the standard goods, the Robinson goods in New South Wales, 1 at Richmond Vale Railway and 2 at the dreaded Dorrigo Centre. And we identified about 5 or 6 of the Hunslets. After the war, the Hunslet company bought back a lot of the wartime railways, re-gauged them, and sold them off, and they ended up on sugarcane routes in Queensland. So there's about 5 left there, and there's one of the Baldwins, which is at Dreamworld, and Dreamworld thought it'd be a really good idea to turn it into a tender engine and make it look like a Wild West engine, and it's now on plinth outside the thing, but they're the survivors. So there's one operating in the UK, which was taken back from Australia and rebuilt. There's one in the War Memorial, which is the one on the left, and one at the Ipswich Railway Museum, which you can see there. Okay, we'll just finish with the railway colour patch. Each company had its own number in yellow or gold on the actual colour patch. And I'm going to stop at that point. There's been a gallop across the topic, but I hope it has given you some insight into a fairly rare and very much unknown sort of feature. There are about 1,500, perhaps even 2,000 people went through these units. So it's bigger than a unit and smaller than a brigade, because they weren't part of the Australian Corps, mentions them only about half a dozen times. And most of those are in footnotes.
Do you have time for questions?
Looking at the command structure,
and the coordination, which was obviously one of the big challenges in the early stages. I'm just wondering whether they wanted to go back and look at what had happened during the American Civil War when they ran into the same sort of difficulties, and of course Lincoln appointed a brigadier general from one of the railway companies to basically take command of the Union Railways, and then that streamlined things a lot more.
It's a good question. I can't give you a definitive answer except to say the British Army had a long history of railways and had if you like, a railway philosophy and doctrine. But as I mentioned there, the whole thing went up in smoke. I mean, they had agreed on an approach of the French, and it fell over because it got out of control. To get back into control, they put it. Now, and Geddes is an extraordinary man. I mean, he goes on to actually create the face of British Rail in the 1920s. He's the one that says, we can't operate with all these small companies any longer. We're going to have 4 big railway companies. So you're talking about, the so-called Geddes Acts, but an extraordinary man. I mean, he's an admiral. He eventually becomes the First Lord of the Admiralty in Parliament. I mean, sort of, he's sort of like every man's war committee in some ways.
Could we have a microphone, please?
Did the Germans ever consider doing a Lawrence Arabia type raid behind enemy lines to interfere? Because obviously it's a bit of a critical port. If you manage to cut it, you do a lot of damage.
Look, it's a great question, but think back to what actually happens on the Western Front. Nobody was making raids on the Western Front apart from small company or battalion size raids. And the Germans had the same system as, but they were more sophisticated at the start, and they were ready for a light rail system. They had even their engines on standard gauge trucks ready to roll on behind the army. The answer is, the only way to disrupt it was aerial bombardment. And there is an example of where one of the light railway companies reports that these Lewis gunners had shot down an attacking German aircraft. So they tried it on. It was one of the occupational hazards, taking a bomb down your funnel.
Any other questions?
I just want to make a statement if I could.
Nothing to do with railways. Fascinating talk. But I go back to your point, and I didn't quite get the analogy with Admiral Hudson about adaptability, flexibility to meet an expedient. I once, only a matter of years ago, some of you may know Colonel Richard Morgan, who was heading up the Australian Army Cadets here in New South Wales. He was a reviewing officer at school cadet parade I was attending. The next thing I find him wearing a commander's uniform, and he's now heading up the Sea Cadets or something or other of Australia, but he must get his salute mixed up.
Can I just make a comment? The comment was, there are a lot of people in Australia today who will tell you point blank that unless you are doing a particular job, you cannot be doing that job with a higher rank. The allusion to Mike Hudson was quite simply at the end of Mike Hudson's career as Vice Admiral, Chief of Navy. Bob Hawke said he's already got an AC, what can we do for him? So he basically promoted him to full admiral in the last week of his career, which meant he retired as a 4-star officer with a 4-star officer's pension. Now, there are plenty of people who tell you that that can't happen, it's illegal and so on. The answer is there are Australian examples of that.
Thank you very much for a very, very interesting discussion. I'm a railwayman, retired railwayman, so this is why I'm here today. And just jumping to the 60s, there was approximately ARHS found for us approximately 923 railwaymen that were called up for national service. It was no railway company in the 60s, of course. They went to all different corps. And of that 923, statistically they came up with a figure of 2 killed in action, and I have found one, which is Private Peter Arnold, a former shunter from Inverell, who was killed on the 27th of February 1967. I just wanted to share that with you.
I just had 2 questions because we are running out of time.
Thank you very much. I'm still with the Railways, 40 years there. Take my hat off for all the knowledge you've got and your explanation of how the complicated system works. Just briefly, I have a distant cousin, a second cousin, who was in the 5th Rock, and he was there originally in the 2nd Division, and he didn't cut it. He was the son of a railway man, he was the grandson of a railway engineer, and eventually they worked out after about 10 runs on him that he might be good in the railways, and he found his niche there travelling around Picardy. And then when the war ended, they would go into Germany and bring back armaments, and particularly the Gotha bombers. So just thought I'd share that, these people are very real.
Just inquiring once again about the member that a volunteer that went to the RAD, the different ages, and of course, because of the confusion and everything, there was a lot of old men went, including a relative of mine, that there's no way of actually knowing what positions they held unless it's recorded on military paperwork. My relative was 54 years of age and served there about 16 months and took ill. And they discharged him because of age and debility. But there's no way of finding out any records of people who were in the different units. Thank you.
Firstly, no one has actually done any unit histories of any of the railway companies. The only information that you would have is contained in the war diaries of the relevant railway company, which I recommend you can find at AWM. Generally speaking, the broad gauge companies are hard to track because they're essentially a resource which is deployed across the entire system. The light rail companies you can track a little bit better, but even they are difficult and you have to actually spend some time doing it. I'm not sure that answers your question, but the answer is, the bottom line is, your answer is no. It is very difficult to find where they are operating.
Well, can we put our hands together for David?